Hello and welcome to Goldster Inside Story. It's so good to see everybody. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour of insightful and entertaining conversation. Now, last week, as the Ukraine war began, my guest was the American military interrogator Lena Sisko, whose job is to tell lies from truth. Today, we continue that theme by digging deeper into how political news gets to us, why headlines unfold as they do, and the secret society inside our parliament and corridors of power that acts as a filter as to what we know and what we don't know. So what does it mean when we read a story attributed to senior sources close to the Prime Minister or some such phrase, and then another unnamed source close to someone else in power tells us that what the Prime Minister is saying is a load of rubbish? And who do we believe? And what is going through the Prime Minister's mind when he decides to sanction one Russian oligarch and not the other, or make a statement about a COVID rule-busting party? As BBC political correspondent, our guest today was a member of this club of journalists known as the Lobby for 20 years. But it is so arcane that she only found out that it had a list of written rules when she was researching her book, which I've got here, which is Lobby Life by Carole Walker, Inside Westminster's Secret Society, which is what they call, or what I call, a thundering good read, giving us a behind-the-scenes glimpse and more on prime ministers from Ramsay MacDonald to Boris Johnson. Welcome, Carole Walker, to Goldster Inside Story.
Thanks very much, Humphrey, and thank you for that introduction. And great to have so many people with us, and I'm sure you'll have lots of good questions. And yeah, it's a treat to be on your show.
It's great to have you. But first off, let us ground our conversation, because I'm one that doesn't like assumed knowledge. What exactly is the lobby?
Well, I think it's a very good question. And I should say that on my first day in the BBC's Westminster office, when I'd switched from general news and foreign reporting, I didn't know myself. And the boss said to me, well, Carole, you better go to the lobby with John. And I wasn't sure which, is this the lobby of the Commons? Is it the lobby of the building? And which John is it? There were actually more BBC political correspondents called John at that time than there were women in the lobby. So there was some confusion. So the lobby is a club, as you mentioned in your introduction, of all the Westminster journalists, and you get a little brown laminated pass. And it's a kind of access all areas VIP pass to the parliamentary estate. You can go to lots of parts of Parliament where ordinary members of the public can't go, including, crucially, the members' lobby, which is the bit right outside the Commons chamber. That's why it's called the lobby. And you also get briefings from the Prime Minister's official spokesperson twice a day when Parliament is sitting. And though that is technically a lobby briefing, it's often abbreviated to saying we're going to the lobby, which is what they were talking about on my first day. I was just going to say there is one other kind of quite important meaning of the word the lobby, because people talk about how you can have a conversation on lobby terms. And that is essentially means that you can, so I'm having a conversation and someone will say, well, it's strictly on lobby terms, Carole. So I can quote them, but I can't reveal who has told me that. And that is part of the rules and the etiquette that surround what was once a very secretive organization.
So lobby term. So just to clarify, in my mind, that's different from being a lobbyist, isn't it? Although it's the same word. So why is it different?
Yeah.
What is a lobby?
Yeah, also very good question. We heard a lot about this with David Cameron, didn't we? Lobbyists are people who are paid by companies to talk to influential people in and around government to say to them, look, it would be a really good idea if you help this sector, if you tweak this rule or regulation, because it might help us. And the lobby, the Westminster lobby, is completely separate. The only thing they're seeking in return for their efforts is a decent story for their broadcast or their newspaper, or these days their website. So not to be confused with lobbyists.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's the lobbyists that have fallen into a bit of disrepute lately, and they do cyclically, as you say in your book, whereas the lobby correspondents at the moment are a little pure, say. But talking in the Goldster's Register of Interests, I should declare that Carole and I have been distant colleagues for many years, but your husband, a much closer colleague, because his pen and eagle eye has been through my dispatches since the early 1990s. Tony Grant was for many years the legendary editor of the Radio 4 flagship program From Our Own Correspondence. So you are what the papers might call a power media couple.
Well, thank you, Humphrey. And I take no responsibility for any changes he made to your brilliant dispatches, I'm sure.
But you also began your career, as you mentioned, as a foreign correspondent. I won't say if you ever filed for Tony or not, but wars, rebellion, mayhem, and you were doing really, really well at it. So why the switch?
Yeah, well, it's really come back to me over the last week or two. When we look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, I spent a lot of time reporting on the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, one thing that really strikes me is it was a time when Russia was really opening up. And I remember literally the joy on the streets as they tore down some of the old Soviet statues. And it is just desperately upsetting what is happening in Ukraine, but in Russia too, to a people who I think thought that they were on a path to freedom and democracy. And we look at what is happening, it's tragic. But I loved my life as a foreign correspondent. When I had 2 small children under the age of 2, it was quite a struggle to juggle the two, to be a responsible mother when the phone would ring and it would be, Carole, can you get to the airport now? We want you to do this. A very unpredictable life. So I thought I would just try a switch to politics for a little while. I mean, the politics got under my skin, I have to say, and I became totally hooked on it. But there was a moment when I was in the office not long after I'd come back to work, and my little boy was about 5 months old, I think, and our daughter not quite 2. And the foreign editor said, we've got a great idea, Carole. North Korea are beginning to do some tourism, and you can be taken on a tour around the country. And we thought you could take a little camera and, get us some footage of what's going on inside North Korea. And I thought about this and I thought, well, yeah. And I mean, I was an on-screen BBC correspondent. It wouldn't have taken them very long to spot what I was actually doing. And I just felt that I couldn't really put myself at the risk of spending the rest of my life in a North Korean gulag. But I genuinely felt torn. Humphrey, I felt awful eventually saying no. And I just felt that I couldn't live with those sorts of dilemmas. And it was at that point I decided to move to Westminster, where, there might be some pretty hostile exchanges on the floor of the Commons or the corridors of power. But at least I would hopefully be able to get safely home at the end of the day.
Yes, but you never knew what time you were going to get home to, though, did you? I mean, it's still not an easy life. It's not a 9-to-5 job, is it?
No, it's very definitely not a 9-to-5 job. There are still a lot of late night sittings, a lot of late night votes, developments, and of course, late night output to be serviced. So, and interestingly enough, talking to some of even the top female political correspondents today, talk about just how difficult it is to try to manage the right balance between work and family life. But of course, that especially is something which men struggle with as well. It is a hugely demanding job. And it's a demanding job because you can't just clock off at the end of your day. If you want to develop the right sort of contacts, the right people that you can speak to, the right kind of relationships with people that you can then ring at all hours of the day and night when things do happen, it does involve, a bit of after work drinks, a bit of that socializing, networking, call it what you like. And it's very difficult if you say, well, I'm going to go home for bath time tonight. And that was certainly not something I ever felt I could say when my kids were small. I think organizations, the BBC and others, are now much more understanding about family commitments than they were certainly in my early days as a political correspondent, when my boss, who was a woman, agreed to give me a tryout as a political correspondent, having switched across, as I explained. And she said, yeah, but I don't want to hear any crap about getting home to your babies or your feeding your child. And it was very clear to me that this was not something that I should even be, discussing in the office. And so after these frantic calls when, the au pair had gone sick and there was no one to pick the kids up.
The babysitter on one hand and the Prime Minister on the phone in the other. And
I should have put them onto one another.
Take us back to those days when you did join. That was in 1996, the dying days of the John Major's government. And then we were moving from that into this area of what's known as spin, weren't we? And there were all sorts of big stories happening, but they were being spun through the lobby. So tell us how that works. And if any of you have got any questions, comments, or anything you want to put to Carole, feed them in. I will put them to her and she will answer them, because we talked before the show and I said, is there anything you don't want to talk about? And she said everything she can talk about. But take us back, 1996, you walk in with John and lots of Johns around you into this lobby. And then how did it work? How does it develop? All these big stories we hear about.
Well, in those days, the lobby briefings were held in a sitting room in number 10 Downing Street. So we would literally walk in the front door of Downing Street, go into a sitting room. There was, and indeed still is, Humphrey, to be honest, a real hierarchy to the lobby. So all the major political editors and chief political correspondents of organizations like the BBC, the Times and the Telegraph, all blokes, of course, in those days, bagged seats on the comfy armchairs and the settee and so on. And new girls like me kind of sat on the floor. And the Prime Minister's spokesperson, who in those days was Sir Christopher Mayor, who went on to be the British ambassador to Washington.
Is that the guy with the socks?
Brilliant. Yes, the first thing I got was a great view of his lovely red socks. And he was charming and he was entertaining and there was a lot of banter and there's a lot of toing and froing. And you got the sense that he actually quite enjoyed the sort of gentle jousting and would use a bit of humor to try to deflect difficult questions. But he will set out what the Prime Minister's day is. Prime Minister's going to be in the Commons answering questions later this afternoon, and then he's got a visit to a school or whatever. And then it's, open season for questions. But the key thing is that in those days, you couldn't attribute it. I certainly couldn't say the Prime Minister's spokesperson has told us. I couldn't even say a Downing Street, actually, sorry, by that stage, I could talk about a Downing Street source, but I certainly couldn't name him. But that change had only happened under Sir Bernard Ingham, who was Margaret Thatcher's.
He was one before, wasn't he? Yes.
Exactly. He was, actually was Gus O'Donnell immediately preceded Christopher Mayor. But Bernard Ingham, famously, of course, who people I'm sure will have heard of, was Margaret Thatcher's.
With the eyebrows, right?
With the amazing eyebrows, was Margaret Thatcher's press secretary. And he fought a huge battle, which actually led to a boycott of the lobby, to say that they couldn't name him as a Downing Street source. So you would have stories that he would have told the newspapers, and you would have political correspondents like John Sargent or John Cole, who some people may remember, saying things like, well, I understand that the Prime Minister believes that the miners are behaving very in in a very irresponsible manner or something. And there would be no way of people listening or watching this stuff or reading about it in their newspapers. They would have no way of knowing what that source was. And sometimes people would talk about Westminster sources. Well, that could be anyone. That could be one of the Prime Minister's opponents telling you something. So, and I should say that this is there is, if you look at the original lobby rules, there is rule number, I think it's 5. I may not have that number right,
but you only discovered after you had left. Is that right?
Exactly. And it's you have the full rules in the appendix of my book. But there's a big line that says, "Do not talk about lobby briefings. Don't talk about them in the potential earshot of somebody who may overhear what you're saying and learn that a lobby briefing from the Prime Minister's spokesperson has taken place." And the wonderful Christopher Moncrief, sadly no longer with us, who was for many, many years chief political correspondent of the Press Association news agency, told me that when he started in the lobby in the 1960s, very late 1960s, he was told, he said to me, I talked to him shortly before he died, actually, and he was wonderful. And he said it was like MI5, and he was told that he should not, he was explicitly told, do not tell your wife you have been to a lobby briefing from the Prime Minister's spokesperson. So that is the mystique that surrounds it all. It has changed over the years.
And just give me a picture of this room where you sat on the carpet. How many people were in the room?
There would be, in those days, I guess, no more than about 14 or 15 people.
14, and these were the key people that were feeding us with our headline news of the political news. Roger asks the question, what agency authorizes lobby correspondence and how many are there? That's what I just asked. Is it an agency or?
It is actually it is actually controlled by the Commons authorities. So it's sort of ultimately Black Rod, but it will be somebody below him who authorizes who gets a lobby pass. And of course, you have to go through security screening and so on, because you're going to be allowed into sensitive parts of the parliamentary estate. I should say that these days, it's opened up hugely. Under Alistair Campbell, briefings went.
It was Tony Blair's
who was Tony Blair's chief press secretary and spin doctor. He decided to put lobby briefings on the record, so he could be quoted as a spokesman for Tony Blair or a spokesman for the Prime Minister. And indeed, there'd been a huge row over various comments that he had made, and he decided it was better if it was all open. And he actually, having announced this, having had battles about it for decades of exactly how you can describe the Prime Minister, and there were conversations between the lobby committee, because there is a committee that controls the lobby as well as the parliamentary authorities. He just announced unilaterally that he was going to go on the record, and he arrived in the lobby briefing room with recording equipment. And at one stage, at brief summaries, at least, of the lobby briefings would appear on the Downing Street website sometime later on in the afternoon, which I have to say was a huge relief to me, because my shorthand was always absolute rubbish. And until that point, you couldn't, like now you can go in with your dictaphone and check the exact quote back. In my early days, that wasn't possible.
Let's stay on that theme. I want to get back to the big stories in a minute. Let's stay on that theme for a moment, because if Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's quite famous press secretary now, isn't he? His head way above the parapet in many things, a close friend of Tony Blair. He began that, but throughout you keep this debate going as whether it should be televised or not, whether it should be like the White House briefings and all the rest of it. What were the arguments that made that go backwards and forwards? And I'm asking that because our latest, knowledge of this, as much as we follow it, is that sort of video of Allegra Stratton, the former press secretary or whatever of Boris Johnson, that video leaking when she was doing a sort of test of that, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, there have been battles throughout the history of the lobby that have gradually opened up who can belong to it, Under Alistair Campbell, for example, it was opened up to overseas news publications that they could get a lobby pass. Each organisation would be limited to 1, 2 or 3, let's say, per organisation. Or now, in the case of something like the BBC or Sky News, you'll have probably at least a dozen or so people who get a lobby pass. But that process of openness has gradually happened over the years. Alistair Campbell, as I mentioned, decided that his briefings would go on the record, and that was a big moment. When Boris Johnson, after Boris Johnson won his big majority in 2019,
that wasn't it? Yes.
And the key figures around him in those days were Dominic Cummings, who I'm sure people will be aware of, was his chief advisor, and Lee Cain was head of the media operation. And Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain had worked very closely together on the Vote Leave campaign. And they were convinced that part of the reason that they succeeded in securing the vote to leave the EU was because of the way that they had managed to communicate directly with voters, cutting out the Westminster core of political correspondence. They believed that if they could communicate directly to the public, that would be great. We'd get rid of these pesky Westminster journalists who know the inside track, who are talking to lots of other sources and can ask lots of very difficult questions, and will give everybody else's perspective. They wanted to communicate directly. So they, and I don't know whether people will remember, but in the 2019 election campaign, there were lots of battles between Johnson's team and the media. He refused to go on the Andrew Neil show. They then ministers started to boycott the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, the ITV News morning show, a Channel 4 News, and so on.
This was an attempt to bypass you, the lobby, and go straight to me in my living room on Facebook, Twitter, and that sort of thing. But it didn't work, did it?
No. What is interesting is, so what happened was there were massive battles that went on, and then the pandemic hit, and relations between the media and the government, or Downing Street specifically, were pretty bad at that stage. And the government realized that it really couldn't afford to have that level of hostility. So essentially a truce was declared. They then, of course, as people will be well aware, began these direct news conferences with the Prime Minister, other senior ministers, and the scientific advisors. And they thought that they were a great success. Now, what is interesting is that the lobby briefings continued alongside those news conferences.
In parallel.
And so, exactly, in parallel. And when you speak to, I had left the lobby by then, but when I spoke, as I did to many political correspondents who were in there, would say that even though the briefings went online during the worst of the pandemic, in a sense, it made them even bigger because everybody would, it was such a crucial source of information. But people would tease out all sorts of questions, So, you say that hospitals have got all the protective equipment that they want. Well, why has this hospital in this place got absolutely none of that? What can you say about this? What can you say about this contract? And so on. And all the political journalists felt that they still got a huge amount out of those background briefings which were on the record but not broadcast widely to the public. So and because you can tease, because you can come back with 3 or 4 questions.
So the end result of that, Carole, is in our minds, the general public's minds, is the sort of huge amount of wasted money, huge amount of corrupt contracts. Matt Hancock with his mistress, the health secretary. I mean, that's what sticks in our minds. Please, if you disagree with my assessment, all of you just say that Humphrey's talking rubbish. But is that, all this sort of media manipulation trying to go on, but at the end of the day, that's what we're thinking?
Yeah, and what happened, which is fascinating, is that Downing Street decided these on-camera news conferences have been such a success. We're going to press ahead. We're going to have these White House style press briefings, which we heard news of in the summer of 2020. Allegra Stratton was hired to take on the job, did, as we now all know, those rehearsals for it. And her arrival sparked off a huge battle within Downing Street as to who was going to have the ear of the Prime Minister. She was rightly saying, well, look, I can't be facing the media every day and briefing on his behalf unless I get proper access. That ruffled a lot of feathers. There was then a lot of internal briefing with Prime Minister's wife, Carrie, dragged into it, which led eventually to Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain leaving. She carries on doing the rehearsals, but they then realize, well, it's actually going to be quite tricky, isn't it? Because people are not just going to be asking about pandemic figures and the rate of the vaccine rollout. They're going to be asking about, what about this, the cost of the Prime Minister's wallpaper and who did pay for that? And what about Jennifer Arcuri, this businesswoman, says she was treated very, very badly indeed. And, what about the suggestions that, it was Carrie who said this and that, and the new team around Boris Johnson realized that they would be, as one source put it to me, it was a high wire with no safety net. And one word out of place from Allegra Stratton would be replayed endlessly on not just the mainstream media, but all the social media. And they pulled the online briefings. Well, the on-camera briefings, I should say.
What is the cultural difference then between us in Britain and the White House in America, where they do these daily briefings on camera that we all see, and very rarely is the press spokesperson tripped up in the way that Allegra Stratton or anybody is here?
Well, I think that there are, as you say, cultural differences. And part of that is that America is just a much more open society, much more open to the media. But if you talk to White House correspondents, they say, well, yeah, we get that briefing from Jen Psaki, who is President Biden's chief press officer at the moment. But then we all go, when the cameras are turned off, we go and ask all these extra questions. And then we nip round to talk to these various Congress men and women and senators who know what's really going on. And you have a little, you have the on-camera quote that you can use, very useful if you're a broad part of the broadcast media, and they can put out important lines on that. But if you really want to dig deep into what's going on,
you have to do
that's just a tiny part. I should say, of course, it is quite important to point out that if you're a lobby correspondent, you don't just go along to the Downing Street news briefing and then do the story. You talk to everyone else. You talk to other ministers. You talk to other special advisors. You talk to opposition politicians. You talk to some of the stakeholding groups about where they go. The key thing about being a lobby correspondent, people say, one of the big criticisms of the lobby system has always been, oh, well, it's just people being spoon-fed lines from number 10. But no political correspondent would last 5 minutes in our hugely competitive media world if that's all they did. They'll be going from that lobby briefing, testing the arguments, testing the points, discovering whether what they've been told is true, whether it's the whole truth, or whether it's accurate, or whether they've left out an important rider. And it is very important to point that out, because that's one of the big criticisms. And I should say, one of the treats of writing this book is talking to many of those largely men, one or two women who have briefed the media. And if you talk to them, they would tell you that the idea that they can simply feed these hard-bitten political correspondents with lines to take is frankly laughable.
You talk about some of them being terrified. Roger has come back and said, do you know how many authorized lobby journalists there are, or roughly?
I would need to check the precise figure, but I think it's about 120 something now.
About 120, Roger. And Patrick says, listen, do politically timed leaks come through the lobby? or do they come from down? How does that work?
Leaks don't come from the lobby. A leak will be something that you've managed to get from an unauthorized source. Will be, when we've seen, for example, evidence of emails sent out from Downing Street about parties. That will not be something that will have been given away in a briefing from the Prime Minister's spokesperson. That will be that journalist having their own other sources, because as I was saying, it's really important to have lots of other sources who will have obtained that. What you do get sometimes is embargoed briefings. So you might go to a briefing from the Prime Minister's spokesperson, perhaps in the afternoon, and they will say, okay, at midnight tonight, the Prime Minister is going to announce sanctions on these 3 mates of President Putin. And you can't use that material until the embargo, until midnight. Right. But we're telling you this in advance so that you can get your notes together on who these people are. And we're telling you exactly what these sanctions will mean. And by the way, we're going to seize his yacht as well. But you can't say that until that information, until the embargo is lifted.
That would be, Suri has a question about Putin, which we're going to talk about in just a second. What I'd like you to do now, Carole, is pick a story during your long career, one that we all know about, Cash for Questions, whatever, and just talk us through how you covered it and how it then came into our living rooms. Or anything,
gosh, yes, I'm just trying to think. To be perfectly honest, Humphrey, I think some of the biggest stories are just those moments of change when power changes from one party, from one leader to another. Right. And you just get this sense that, and very often this happens quite suddenly. I mean, one of the first big stories I covered was that I went out on the road on the election campaign with Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell in 1997, which was when decades of Tory rule came to an end and we had a new Labour government, and it was a massive shift of power. Yeah. But you will also have moments when you just realize that things have changed and will never be quite the same again. And if I think back to the EU referendum result, yes. I remember I was just getting up at 4 a.m. because I knew I was working early and was going to be working through. So I grabbed a little bit of sleep when it was finally confirmed that Leave had won the EU referendum. And it was just one of those days when we had the result confirmed. And by, I'm just trying to remember exactly what time it was. I think it was mid-morning. David Cameron walked into the street in Downing Street, and I was crouched in Downing Street with my microphone, commentating on radio on that occasion, as he announced that he was going to resign as Prime Minister. And you just have this sense, and it is a huge privilege, and I did have an amazing time as a political correspondent, of being there when the country is changing, the people who are running the country, who are, when it comes down to it, a very small number of people who are running the country. That has changed.
Yes.
That is changing. And with it, many of the things that we have taken for granted over the previous few years.
And then you also find that you're working on the other side of the fence was with your former colleagues. For instance, Craig Oliver, who was David Cameron's spokesman during the Brexit campaign, used to be the editor of the 10 o'clock news that we both worked for. Dominic Cummings, I don't know about that, but these two were pitted against each other in a way, weren't they? And you were having to report on both.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, you do get to know people, and yeah, you do sometimes have a situation where, yeah, Craig Oliver had been an output editor on the BBC 10 o'clock news, and he's there briefing on behalf of the Prime Minister. But I think this is when I think your professional ethics and integrity come into it. And, people will talk about, well, how can you have a drink or a lunch with somebody and then do a story that does them down? that is just what happens. And both sides recognize that. You can get to know somebody, you can, to a degree that, let's say if you go on a trip with the Prime Minister, you will perhaps in the bar late at night be having a drink with the Prime Minister's media team, or even some of his special advisors and security advisors. I have done, and everyone recognizes that this is that it's useful. It's a two-way street. Downing Street have to get their message across, and as a political correspondent, you need to know what Downing Street is thinking. That is why the lobby has survived for so long, because essentially, and I remember talking to the wonderful Professor Peter Hennessy, as you know, that there is this sort of mutual sort of love-hate relationship that, you know, they rely on each other, and neither of them can give up this relationship because they are mutually dependent.
I just want to go back now. Suri had a question. Do you think Putin is retreating into solipsism? But you have in the book some very detailed stuff about the lead up to the Second World War and the lobby and how all that worked, and the rise of Hitler. And you've got there, I found no accounts in any of these pre-war lobby briefing occasions when reporters challenged the blatant untruths they were being told. Tell us about that, and also can you juxtapose it against what we're hearing now about the oligarchs and Putin and all of that?
Yeah, well, one of the fascinating bits of research that I did during my work on the book was to go to the parliamentary archives and to go in and go through the lobby records. Now, of course, they don't always tell you what was very, you know, especially the older ones don't actually tell you what was said in those. But there are accounts from people who were there, and Neville Chamberlain, who was Prime Minister before Winston Churchill. And as we know, and there has been this wonderful film Munich that people may have seen, Chamberlain thought that he could negotiate with the Nazis. He believed that he could reach a deal to keep Britain out of the war, and people will remember that moment he came back, peace in our time, and he waved this document. Now, Neville Chamberlain used to brief the lobby journalists in person, and indeed sometimes he'd take some of them for dinner at a nice club in St. James's, and he would say to them, "It's going really well, you know, Hitler, Stalin, nobody really wants to widen the war this way. I'm going to get a great deal. We're going to be absolutely fine here in the UK. We're going to be kept out of the war. So there's no need to worry. And you can go off on your long weekend and don't worry about it because there's not going to be any big developments. I've got it sorted," and so on. And because of the way that there were these strict rules, which I talked about earlier on what you could attribute, these stories would appear in those days with no attribution at all. So you would pick up your newspaper, and of course, the BBC was in its infancy, and the newspapers were the main source that people found out what was going on. And of course, there was no social media. There were no people reporting from the front, from their mobile phones right across Europe. And you'd pick up your newspaper, and the newspapers would say, "Excellent progress is being made in the negotiations with Hitler, which will ensure that there is peace, at least here in the UK, and that Britain will be kept out of the war." And it is quite astonishing when you read some of the accounts of some of the journalists there who seem to have only realized later, when Hitler invaded Sudetenland and the war broke out, that he had been, through a combination of either lies or ludicrous self-belief, had convinced himself that he was going to sue for peace and it was all going to be fine. But the lobby was used in those days, I mean, to deceive the British public about what was really going on.
But how does that compare now if we think about, Roman Abramovich, who's being sanctioned, or, these oligarchs that ran Knightsbridge and Chelsea and all the rest of it. And also, as you were talking, I was thinking that golden era that we had with China a few years back, where David Cameron and George Osborne were, wanting China to build all our railways and nuclear power stations. How was the lobby used then? I mean, were you being fed stuff that was, how did that operate?
Well, yeah, I mean, what will happen is, for example, now, I know that in the lobby briefings, the Prime Minister's spokesperson will be getting a very hard time. Why aren't we plonking sanctions on Roman Abramovich? Why have the EU imposed sanctions on these 30 or so Russian individuals, and we haven't done so yet? And the explanation that they're getting is that we've actually got our own separate sanctions regime. And what happened was, during the passage of that bill in the Lords, there was a big fight back from lawyers saying, look, if you're going to seize somebody's property or their wealth or all of their assets, you've got to have good grounds for doing so. And so the government is being advised, well, look, if you just seize the assets of this person without reasonable proof that they are mates of President Putin's, then the government could be sued. So what will be happening behind the scenes is that the political correspondents will be really testing, what is the government doing? What about this individual? Why aren't we sanctioning this individual? Why is that going on? And if you talk about the China example, I remember some of those briefings, and we were being told a lot about the potential trade opportunities that would be there by improving the relationship between the UK and China. And people would say, well, what about this evidence of the persecution of the Uyghur minorities? This evidence of the way that dissidents are locked up, tortured, sent off to these barbaric prisons. And the response would be, well, the government believes that we need to have a dialogue about this, and that if we open up a dialogue about wider issues, we are in a stronger position to influence the Chinese regime, and that would be their justification. But journalists will be raising these questions very much in those briefings. And I should just say, the days when under Neville Chamberlain, people sat around and had a nice dinner and, oh, right, well, thank you very much, Prime Minister.
That's finished.
I remember huge rows in lobby briefings, huge arguments between the media, who'll gang up on the spokesperson and say, what are you talking about? And somebody will say, what do you mean this person is okay? Here's the evidence that they were closely involved in this decision of President Putin's last year, and so on.
So Roger says, I suspect you haven't got an answer to this. Is there any kind of equivalent to the lobby in the Kremlin?
Well, look, it's many years since I worked in Russia, and clearly what is happening there is an absolutely massive clampdown on any free media in Russia, which I think it is just desperately appalling move, not just for Russia, but for the whole of the world. I understand that there are certain approved briefings that are given out to the media, but I'm not an expert on that. And of course, we've seen President Putin. I mean, he does these news conferences, and he's done them in front of the media, and he's happy to take questions for an hour and a half.
Once here, Emma says, do political journalists ever hold back information from members of the public? If yes, what sort of information would that be?
Well, I think that there will be occasions when you might be, I don't, as a journalist, you want to get your stories out there. That is the point. You want to put them out in your newspaper, on your on your broadcast. So that is what journalists want to do. I'm not aware of any journalists who are doing it to protect someone who was a mate of theirs.
Unless it's a bad story, of course, and then you just don't.
Yeah, but what you what frequently happens, and I'm sure, Humphrey, that this has happened during your long career as a journalist as well, is that you will get indications that something is happening, but you are not 100% sure. You're not maybe 100% sure that you can trust the informant that you've given. You might want to get other sources on it. And you may have to go through your organization's lawyers if what you're saying is potentially libelous. You may find that, and BBC lawyers, I don't know about your experience of them, in my day were incredibly cautious.
Yes,
and saying, you can't say that, you can't say that.
It's nothing, yes.
So I don't think journalists, I don't think political journalists withhold information, but they may delay sharing it more widely until they're confident. In the BBC, there used to be a rule that you had to have at least 2 sources. Yeah. And if it's a big story, you need to be damn sure what you're saying before you put it out there, because you could personally be sued.
And there's the balance of stories, isn't there? Because you write fascinatingly, when you're on tour, these very rushed tours with the Prime Minister or something, you'll be in Afghanistan or Pakistan in dreadful situations, but all the editors will want to know is something about the floods or the scandal that's going on in Britain. How does that, as a journalist, sort of tear you? It must tear you on what you're trying to sell to the editors.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a chapter in the book called "The Lobby on Tour," and this is one of the treats of being a political correspondent, I have to say, because you go off on tour with the Prime Minister and his or her close entourage, and usually you get on the plane and you'll get word, well, John Major or Theresa May or whoever is going to come back and have a chat with you. And usually this will be on lobby terms. So you can say, I understand that the Prime Minister is going to say this, that, and the other. But you can't directly quote them, and you won't actually see that on your TV screens. But the Prime Minister and his team will set off on this tour with a clear idea of the message that they want to get out. And the media pack will have a very different idea of the story that they want to get out. I mean, I remember going with David Cameron when he was actually then still leader of the opposition, and we went to Rwanda, where David Cameron wanted to use this as an example of how the Conservatives were going to change their international development policies. And Rwanda, as many people will know, had been at the center of a huge genocide, and it was a very moving and a fascinating trip. But there were floods back in the Prime Minister's constituency in Oxfordshire. And every day, I had the news desk at the BBC, well, ask him about the floods, ask him about the floods. And there was huge frustration on the part of the Downing Street team that they were trying to change the image of the Conservative Party, but also its policies on international development and on international relations. And all they were being asked about was some floods in Oxfordshire, which were, I'm sure, really awful for those householders involved. But in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that huge. And of course, people will remember, and of course, things happen. Theresa May had just left what was seen as a successful trip to Washington to talk to Donald Trump. And on the plane, on the way on to the next leg, Trump made some comments about essentially banning migrants to the US if they were from Muslim countries.
Yes, yeah.
And she was completely blindsided by it. And indeed, Tony Blair was on a trip to the Far East when it emerged that Dr. David Kelly, who had been the source of the story,
dossier.
Exactly.
Yes, Iraq War, yes.
The Iraq War. He had been a key source in some of the lines that the BBC had been broadcasting about the reasons for the war in Iraq. And it emerged that Dr. David Kelly, he'd been found dead. It later emerged that he'd committed suicide. And that happened when Tony Blair was on a plane to the Far East. And communications were not what they are today. Blair's team were struggling desperately to find out what was going on. And of course, he landed in Japan. He had a news conference with the Japanese Prime Minister. And people may remember that one of the correspondents traveling with them on the tour from the Mail saying, you know, Prime Minister, have you got blood on your hands? Oh, yes. And it was a moment that that resonated throughout not just British politics, but around the world. So these tours are fascinating. You know, you get to go on the Prime Minister's plane. On the way home, hopefully you get a nice drink with the Prime Minister or whatever, glass of champagne's handed round. It's all very nice. But they are also, if you're trying to broadcast, they are logistically a nightmare, and they are full of unpredictabilities.
I was going to say, everybody, the politicians, the spin doctors, yourselves, you all have to think on your feet, don't you? And as to what's happening. I want to cover, we've only got a few minutes left. I want to cover, you said about the juggling of family and career as a foreign correspondent and a political correspondent, top of the game and everything. But then there emerged the Me Too movement and all that sort of stuff. But you have some quite interesting lines in here, is that although you were in that world and that hands got into places they shouldn't get and suggestions were made, you struggle to think of an occasion when you could realistically have lodged a formal complaint. Give us your mindset in that world. Give us that world.
Yeah. Well, I should say, Humphrey, the Me Too campaign kind of hit Westminster in about 2017, when there were these revelations that a government minister had put his hand on a political journalist's knee. Yes. She didn't want to make a fuss about it, and she didn't want to name the minister concerned, but that name did come out. He eventually lost his cabinet job over it, and it unleashed the floodgates, and a lot of people came out and talked about how they had been, how they had faced misogyny, how they had felt intimidated, threatened by senior politicians. Now, I worked at Westminster for over 20 years. And I have to say, as you mentioned there, I never felt intimidated. I never felt threatened. Now, if you go to something like a party conference, and particularly back in my early years there, yeah, there are occasions and you're at a party and people get too close and maybe their language isn't as good as it should be, and maybe their hands are in the wrong place. But, you know, if I'd gone back to my boss at the BBC at that time and I'd said, look, this Labour minister put his hand on my bottom, they would have said to me, yeah, and that was the culture of the time. Yeah. And perhaps it's just the era in which I grew up. It was something these sorts of things happened when you went to the pub or you went to a party and people had too much to drink. I didn't feel intimidated, perhaps because I was a journalist. I worked with the BBC. Perhaps I was in a more secure position, for example, than some of those junior people who were working with MPs. But I was fascinated that even when you speak to very senior female political correspondents, a lot of them talk about how scary they found it in their early days, how they felt excluded by a little male coterie that might get together after a briefing and decide what they were going to say. And certainly I know that a lot of people found it very difficult. But it's interesting, I talked to people like Eleanor Goodman, who went on to become political editor of Channel 4, and she was there long before me, and others who have Julia Langdon, who really blazed a trail. Yeah. And they also felt that, well, yeah, that was part of what you did and what happened. Now, I'm sure some of the behavior that I experienced then wouldn't happen today. And if it did, perhaps I would take it more seriously.
You'd slap them down more firmly, would you?
Well, I used to slap them. I'd slap the hand, and that usually, told them where to go.
And you had that WhatsApp group, didn't you? You said they set up a WhatsApp group as to watch this minister, watch that one, hands are everywhere, that the female correspondents had, so that you knew not to take a ride back in the taxi with such and such a person. But you mention the political editors now of the BBC, Sky, The Guardian, the Daily Mirror, are all female. So there is this blazing trail that you've been part of that's sort of broken the ceiling.
Yeah, and it's fantastic. And if you look at Beth Rigby, if you look at Laura Koonsberg, people like Caroline Wheeler, others who are really right up at the top of their game, and these are brilliant journalists. And it's great to have women doing that, because I think it encourages more women to go into this job. And I think one of the things I was concerned immediately after all those stories emerged about Pestminster, as one of the papers called it, was that this message went out that this was an appalling place for women to work, and you were going to be pestered every day, and it was full of all these ghastly men who were going to be groping you and invading your personal space. And that is not my experience. Most of the politicians of all parties, at all ranks, who I dealt with, treated me with respect and politeness most of the time. Some of them might have, maybe their behavior left something to be desired after a late night drink at a party conference. But it was a wonderful place to work, a wonderful place to be as a woman, fascinating to be there right at the heart of those big political decisions. And so long as you're prepared to get stuck in and work very hard, I would really encourage any female who fancies the idea of being a political journalist to go in there and have a go.
Now, I want you to stick with us. I'm just going to tell our audience what we've got coming up, and then I'm going to come back with you for a couple of cracking questions. Thursday, March 10th, that's not tomorrow, is it? No, next week. Lucinda is with Tobias Jones, The Dark Heart, and another book, Ultra, the Underworld of Italian Football. That's chilling, murky stuff, very Godfather-esque, it looks like. And then March 11th, I'm with Simon Winchester, who's written about volcanoes, oceans, far-flung places, and his account of how a former school headmaster and a clinically insane murderer collaborated on creating the Oxford English Dictionary and The Professor and the Madman. His latest book is Land, How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. On the 17th of March, I'm with Eric Brown, who's got a new country life murder mystery outset in Suffolk, Murder at the Standing Stone Manor. But Eric is also an acclaimed science fiction and children's writer. He wrote a book called A Monster Ate My Marmite. I don't know what on earth that's going to be. Lucinda with Melanie Hewitt, March 18th, Looking for the Durrells. That's a novel of emotional escape, which many of us need at the moment. Penny, her engagement was broken off. Her father dies, so she heads for Corfu, inspired by the books of the naturalist Gerald Durrell. And there she finds adventure and mystery. And then Thursday, March 24th, I am with Arthur Miller, looking at artificial intelligence in The Artist and the Machine, the world of AI-powered creativity. These are the computer artists that compose music that's more Bach than Bach, Van Gogh that's more Van Gogh than Van Gogh, and screenplays, crack jokes, and all the rest of it. We had Rory Keflin-Jones on recently, who gave us a taste of that world. Arthur is going to give us a little bit more. Carole, computers, are they going to take our jobs, do you think, eventually?
Well, yes, artificial intelligence, it's quite scary, isn't it? I find it hard to believe that a computer will be able to operate in the way that a political correspondent does. But I would say, Humphrey, that technology has transformed the work of a political correspondent. We were talking about the lobby on tour, and in the early days, but people talk about going on tour with Margaret Thatcher and Bernard Ingham, and they'd have a day off, and people went to safari parks on a tour of Africa, and the following day they'd have one story to write for their newspaper, which they had to get in by 5 o'clock that day, and they could have the whole day to think about how they were going to do it and what they were going to say and how they were going to write it. And these days, not only does the technology mean that you can broadcast from just about anywhere that you are around the world, but even if you work for a newspaper, you'll be expected to update the website at every available moment. And of course, we also have information coming at us from citizens around the world, which provides a great deal more information. But of course, the new challenge is sifting the truth from the untruth and the fake news. So huge changes that have happened, and
but not computers.
Who knows? Rory Kethlen-Jones is probably better qualified than I am to say what AI is going to do next.
You and I have computers talking to each other on this show. Now, one last question, a 1 or 2 word answer. Which prime minister that you worked with did you like best? What did you like to put your feet up with and hang out with?
Well, people will be shocked at this, but what I like in a prime minister is somebody who is self-confident enough to talk to journalists without being very cautious about what they say. So the most cautious, the most difficult prime minister to deal with was Theresa May. This is nothing to do with her politics or anything. She was just incredibly reserved. Her and Gordon Brown, incredibly difficult to get something out of. Somebody like David Cameron, and I covered 2 of his election campaigns, would wander down the campaign bus at the end of the day in his socks, have a beer and chat about anything that you liked. So I enjoyed being on tour with somebody like David Cameron, who will talk to you. And as a journalist, it's about feeling that you are finding out more about the person who is running the country. It's nothing to do with his conduct of running the country, his politics, or anything that he's done since. But as a journalist, he was a good prime minister to follow around the world.
David Cameron takes your bet. That's it. Patrick tells us that that we were bludgeoned into daily boredom with the Partygate story. Yes, Patrick, very good point. Emma's asked who are the supporters of Putin. Emma, I tell you what I'll do. I'll email you some links directly on that so you can read that out, because we are out of time. That's it. The great Carole Walker. Tune in to her late show on Times Radio at 10 o'clock at night. The next one's on Monday, I think, is it?
That's
Carole?
right.
Next
Monday to Thursday.
Monday and Thursday.
Monday to Thursday.
Lobby Life, and find out how we really get behind the headlines. Follow Carole on Twitter at Carole with an E, Carole Walker CW. And then until next Thursday, Lucinda with Tobias Jones. Thank you so much, Carole. Thank you, our Goldster team. Thank you all for your questions and comments. Sorry for those I couldn't get to answer. Goodbye, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you so much. It's been brilliant.
Okay, thank you, Carole. And keep your thoughts on Ukraine, everybody. Stay involved, stay active, and above all, stay safe. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye,
Thank
Carole.
you.
Thank you.